Hello everyone, it's Lindsay, and for today's Tip Tuesday, I wanted to share with you some tips for using the Jaimee stamp set from Felicity Jane. So I will link the unboxing down below where I looked at the entire Jaimee kit, and in that unboxing I mentioned that I thought I would share with you guys just some tips for using these stamps, because at first look you kind of look at it and go, well, it's kind of a boring stamp set. I'm not quite sure what I would do with that, but there are so many things you can do with the stamp set. Great for creating custom patterns, and I really think this is one that would be a staple in your supplies. So even if you don't order the entire Jaimee kit, definitely look into picking up the stamp set because I think you'll be able to get a lot of use out of it. So what I have here are a couple of samples. Here is this fun like plaid design. This is just using stamps from the stamp set. You can create a custom dot grid. I'm also going to show how to do a line and line grid, and then there is this fun kind of stripy pattern. So this is going to be a little bit longer of a video just because it takes a little bit of time to show you how to do this, but I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can. Let's start with this plaid design. Now I would suggest using a clear acrylic block that has a line grid, and this is going to give you the best result. I prefer this one from Ranger. It's a little bit thinner. If you're using something that is thicker like this one here, this is great for getting really good impressions. It's easy to hold on to, but the line grid is fairly light, and the thicker acrylic is going to be harder to line things up just because there's a lot more acrylic, a lot more room for distortion between the stamp and your paper, and so I just find a thinner block works a little bit better for me. You can use a stamp positioning tool, something like this one from Tim Holtz. You can get these fairly inexpensive right now from most places. You can get them from Hobby Lobby with a coupon. I tried doing these techniques with this. You can do it. It just takes significantly longer, but you do get better, more precise results. So just kind of depending on how much time you want to spend. I don't usually have a lot of time, so we're going to go for a little more imperfect and get the job done. So let's start with this one here, and that's using this little L-shaped piece right here, and I'm going to show you how to use that. So I'm going to line this up on my stamp block here, and actually I'm going to go this way. I have to think about it for a second, what's easier for me. And this is going to be one of those stamp sets that is just going to take some playing with for you to get comfortable with. So I've gone ahead and lined up my stamp, and one of the tricks is to make sure your stamp is straight from the very get-go. So I have lined it up with the grids on my block, and then when I go to start stamping, I can line up the top of my stamp block and the side of my stamp block with the edges of my paper. And that way I know my first stamp impression is going to be straight. If your first stamp is crooked, the whole pattern is going to be crooked. So it's, you know, good to really take your time for that first stamp. Now I like to work with a piece of paper a little bit larger than what I'm going to use for my project. That way I can cut down any like weird areas and just kind of get more of, you know, the perfect area that's in there and just cut away the excess. So I'm using some Gina K dye inks today. I just pulled out a few that kind of match the Jaimee kit, and I like using these inks. You may find it helpful to use a pigment ink to start with just because they take longer to dry on your stamp, and so you have a little bit more wiggle room for getting things lined up. So I've gone ahead and inked it up, and then I'm going to line up the top of my block and the side of my block with the edges of my paper. Now ideally you would want to get your head right over the top of your stamp, but I'm filming and you don't want to just see the back of my head the whole video, so I'm going to try this without getting my head too far in there. I actually didn't need to clean my stamp. Okay, so for the next impression, what I'm going to do is line up the top of the solid square with the bottom of the impression that I've already done, and I'm also going to line up the edge of my block with the edge of the paper, and that way I make sure that it's perfectly lined up. I do like to ever so slightly overlap my images just so I don't get any weird gapping. It's probably going to happen in this video just because I'm not getting my head over the top of it, so we'll see what happens. But I'm lining up the edge of my paper, and then I'm going to try to ever so slightly overlap, and there you go. You've got that impression there. So you can just keep on going down the side here. We'll just do a couple, and you can see this pattern start to forming. Now for going to the left, I'm going to line up the top of my block with the top of my paper, and then again slightly overlapping what's already been stamped. And it's a little bit wonky, but that's okay. This isn't going to be perfect. You kind of have to embrace imperfection. Of course, like I said, you get your head right over the top of there, and if you go nice and slow, you'll probably have better results, but I just want to show you. So you just continue that. You can see I'm not having to rotate, you know, the stamp anyway. I'm keeping it in that same like upside down L formation and just stamping up and down side by side, and that's how you slowly begin to build up that pattern. Now let's show you how to add some details. So there is this little stitch line. You can use this for borders, for underlining things, but I like to use it to add some detail and make it into more of a plaid pattern. Now this one's a little bit easier to line up. I'm going to line it up with the, again, the line on my block to make sure that it is straight. Clear stamps can't move and wiggle, and so for something like this that you want it to be a straight line, you want to make sure you get it lined up on the block to begin with, or it's going to be crooked. Now I'm going to go in with a little bit darker of an ink. You could go in with black or a different color, and for this one I'm just going to stamp it right in the center of this more open row. And it's slightly crooked, but that's okay. Now to line this one up, it's pretty easy. You're just going to ever so slightly overlap that one side, and the pattern pretty much just melts into itself, and so it's easy to kind of overlap and line up. And so I would just continue to stamp that both horizontally, you know, in both directions, and that's how you get that plaid pattern. So fairly simple with just 2 stamps, and the nice thing about that is you can really create custom patterns to match whatever project colors that you're using. So you can use whatever inks that you like if you have, you know, a certain preference, and so that's kind of nice. So let's go on to a line pattern and then a line grid. I couldn't find my sample that I created, so we'll just go ahead and create it here. So that's using this little set of lines right here. So I've pulled that stamp out. Again, I'm going to start by lining it up on my stamp block to make sure that it is straight. And for this one, I'm actually going to start by lining up the top of my block with the top of my paper, but I'm actually going to line up the edge of the stamp with the edge of the paper rather than the edges of my stamp block, because you can see it leaves a lot of white space. I'm going to line up my stamp with the edge and then the top of my block with the edge of my paper, if that makes sense. And that's going to give me an edge-to-edge design. This one can be a little bit more tricky to line up, but this is great if you're working in something like the Illustrating Bible, which doesn't have a lined margin, or if you're wanting to add some journaling lines to a tag or something like that. This is kind of nice for that. So I'm going to line up the top of my paper and the edge of my stamp and hope I get it fairly straight the first time. It wasn't. Like I said, get your head over the top of there and you will have better results than what I'm going to have in this video. Now for the next stamp, I'm ever slightly going to overlap, and it's going to be hard because it's kind of crooked, overlap my stamping that I've already done. And it would be a little less noticeable if my first one had been straight. But that way I don't have any weird gapping between my images. That one should be a little bit better. There you go. That's a little bit better. Now, to continue this, I have found that it's better to basically double stamp this top line. So I'm going to place that top line over the last part that I stamped rather than trying to guess how much space goes in between. So I'm going to line up that, I'm going to get my head in there. I'm going to line up that top stamp with what was already stamped and the edge of the stamp with the edge of the paper. And you can see it will make that one line a little bit darker just where you're double stamping, but that's better than having an unequal space between, you know, your chunks that you're stamping down. So I'll go ahead, again, I'm going to slightly overlap what's already been stamped. Not too shabby. So there you can see I'm creating these lines. Now if you turn your paper and go in the other direction, you can create a line grid. So if you're wanting a grid pattern, same thing, I'm going to line up the actually I'm going to line up the top of the stamp with the edge of the paper, and then the edge of the stamp with the edge of the paper, edge to edge. That way it's one continuous pattern. I think that'll work the best. And then again, I'm going to slightly overlap what's already been stamped. And I tried to get my head in there, but it wasn't perfect. Like I said, you're going to want to sit and just practice and figure out what works best for you. And definitely getting your head over the top of it helps. Okay, and then for this one, again, overlapping those top and bottom lines. And that's going to start to form your line grid. So you can kind of get an idea of how that would work. And it just gives you kind of an imperfect, hand-done pattern. So yeah, so there's line grid. Let's talk about dot grid. Very, very similar. I find that the dot grid is a little bit easier for me to do and get lined up than trying to keep lines straight. So same thing, I'm going to go ahead and line this up on my block. And then I'm going to take green ink here, just something different. And this one, again, I'm going to line up the edge of the stamp with the edge of the paper, edge of the stamp with the top of the paper, and start it out that way. And as long as your first stamp is straight, then the rest of your pattern will be straight. Now for this one, I like to overlap that row of dots with the row that's already been stamped. So I'm going to go ahead and line that up and double, so this line gets double stamped, and if I had gotten my head over there, it would look more like this one here. So, and that's just easier than trying to, like I said, guess that space in between the stamps. There you go. I say I got my head over the top of it and I got a little bit better of an impression. So this one takes a lot less time than the line grid. You can see you can just really quickly put together a dot grid in whatever color that you want. Okay, moving right along, we'll do the stripe pattern here. Let's just do it on the, we'll do it on the bottom of here. That way I'm not wasting too much paper. Okay, so that's the solid trio of lines right here. And again, I'm going to make sure that I'm lined up on my block nice and straight using those grid lines. And then I'm going to ink this up, and I'm actually going to put something underneath my paper just so I don't stamp my desk. These are dye inks, so they will stain if you're not careful. Okay, so for this one, I'm going to line up with the top edge of the paper and the side edge of the paper. And then this one, you want to ever so slightly overlap. With dye inks, when you re-stamp over the top of an area, the dye ink gets darker. And so you don't want it to be too noticeable where your overlap is. You just want a little bit of an overlap, and this will smooth out as it dries. These Gina K inks are a little bit blotchy when you first stamp them, but then they dry out and smooth out. So I'm going to overlap. You can either overlap that stamp that's already been stamped like this. That was actually pretty good. Or you can guess the distance, because like I said, you are going to end up with a slightly darker line, and so if that bothers you, you can guess, how far down to come down. And that actually wasn't too bad. And then same thing when I'm going over here, I'm going to ever so slightly overlap and get myself lined up here. So a little bit of overlap. So you may end up with kind of a wonky line down the center of your pattern there. So maybe you want to add, some die cuts or something there. But you can see here, it's not too horribly noticeable. If I'd gotten a little bit more overlap, it would have been more like this, which isn't too bad. So this one here, I didn't overlap like I did for the spacing here. I just try to guess my spacing, and you can kind of see where I have some wider white space. So you just kind of have to decide whether you want that darker line or if you want the possibility of, a not even pattern. But if you're working in a stamp positioning tool, you can use your grid to kind of figure out how far to space everything out. But that's how you create that. And of course then you could also go in the other direction and make like a checkered pattern if you wanted to do that. Let's talk about this little scallop piece here. So this one's going to work best if you just butt it up against itself rather than overlapping, because this little loop is a different size than this loop. So you're not going to be able to overlap. You're going to want to kind of nestle them up next to each other. So I'll go ahead and stamp this. And then I'm just going to, I would ideally get right up over the top of it and then just butt it up next to each other. And then that's going to give me that continuous scallop pattern. So I hope that helps with some ideas for how to use the stamp set. Of course, there's all kinds of other cute little stamps in here. There's that faux stitching line. Let me show you that. There's this little like faux stitching here. There are the hearts and stars and bows. You've got your little check mark boxes that you can use with your little filler box. So, but that just kind of helps give you some ideas for how to use the pattern stamps to create some fun custom colored patterns for your projects. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave those down below. Check out the description box for links to everything that I mentioned today. Give this video a thumbs up if it was helpful. Subscribe to my channel if you're not already subscribed. And until next time, thank you so much. Bye-bye.